keeping with wild times, it's wild times that both Dave and I are here for the first time in what seems like a long time.
Yeah,
It's awesome to
it-
see you again.
it's great seeing you too. You look like you've been out in the sun and enjoying life, and it looks like I need to get out in the sun and enjoy it a little bit more.
Yeah, not entirely by choice. I'd say there was like a very small amount of relaxing and a lot of landscaping and outdoor outdoor chores taking
Uh,
place around my house.
Very nice.
Um, so as we get back into it, we've got a couple things to go through this week. We've got a mailbag item, which is a neat one. This came in from a customer, and so we're going to talk through this really specifically, like and the question they asked, and we'll get into this in a second, is just like specific to SIEM and detection engineering. I think I meant to change the byline there, but that's fine. And then we're gonna dive in and like really want to kind of talk through an ops insight. And Dave, you kind of challenged me yesterday when we were prepping for this to come up with something like a so what for people, and so I did. Although I did it in a somewhat new way for me, and so we're just gonna we're gonna live demo the results of that. So this is going to be exciting.
May the
I
demo gods smile on us.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see how this goes. So first thing I want to kind of take a talk through, and this was a question that came up during a discussion and a little bit of a demo, just diving in with like one of our larger and kind of more sophisticated customers, just kind of understanding like how we perform detection engineering, how our platform works, how we do things like write, tune analytics, measure, and then like why we don't use a SIEM to do that. And so I thought that last bit was a really like that was a specific and interesting question. So I'd say like before I dive into this, there's like a fun bit of Red Canary kind of history or lore, which is that like when we started the company, we absolutely tried to use a SIEM to do this because we did not want to do what we ended up doing, which was build a bespoke platform to do it ourselves. And so, we tried all of the big ones, and not just SIEMs, I'd say, but at the time, like, log aggregation platforms and things like that. And so like I do feel like we gave this a fair shake, but we pretty quickly kind of ran into some challenges. So this is too big of a topic to cover in a small amount of time. So as promised, I'm going to try to hit it in 5 minutes or less. Hopefully less. But like I took this from an internal training presentation that our detection engineering leaders use, and I thought it was useful grounding. The headline is mine, which is just finding bad things. But like I always think it's a useful reminder that like the purpose of a security program, like you can talk about security risk and stuff like that, but like inside of security operations, like your job is to find bad things. That's your only job. There's a whole bunch of benefits you get from that, like lower, business risk and things like that. And like Dave has cool charts to show the board, but like in the SOC, like you wake up every day and you go find bad stuff. And
Right.
so,
So you guys live squarely in the detect and partially in the respond columns of the NIST CSF framework, right?
yep. And if you don't do the first thing, you don't get to do the second thing. And so
Right.
like it is really like detection comes first and you got to build out from there. And so um I borrowed these. I just thought this was a great concise list of like the big considerations that you face when you're doing detection engineering, detection in particular. Um, and we're going to kind of get into a little bit more of the so what of these, but like, attacker adaptability. And so like this is probably like, one of the logic flaws we'll get into, which is, like when you have to tune your analytics, if that's your primary means of managing your workload, you're going to make them increasingly specific, but that means that attackers can make increasingly simple changes and bypass them, right? Um, for us, and this is unique, like most folks here probably don't have to worry about this, but like environmental variance for us is huge. We need to build analytics and build detection and systems and workflows that apply really broadly across thousands of organizations that while they all face mostly the same types of threats against mostly the same types of target systems, they are used in diverse ways, they're managed in diverse ways, and a lot of those manifest as like false positives in the SOC. And that kind of comes to that analyst workload bit, right? Which is like you kind of only have so many governors in a common system. And so like, and then those operational trade-offs, which I think kind of go hand in hand, is like, yeah, coverage versus noise. So if you look really broadly and say PowerShell might be bad, The problem is that in any reasonably sized organization, like there may be hundreds of thousands or even millions of PowerShell like processes in a day. Dealing with specificity and evasion. And again, these are all like very overlapping themes here, but like precise logic, talked about this already. Fewer false positives, but easier to bypass. And then complexability versus maintainability, which is very much like a team impact, which means like really sophisticated logic may yield like really surgically accurate detection criteria analytics, but those are really hard to tune, right? If I spend, and I've seen this, like Splunk's a great example. Like I've been on the phone with like, I remember distinctly like, Mike Hague, who's now at Splunk. But when he was here, like he is a Splunk wizard and he would sit here and show me these wild analytics that he'd made. And if you're another Splunk wizard, you can jump in and understand that and you can kind of unpack it if you need to make changes. But like that can be really, really difficult at scale and over time.
Hey, before you leave that,
Yeah,
I wanted
yeah,
to call out Colin Caves calls out something. I want to get this on your radar
yeah.
to cover. He's like his impression is that no matter how good a third party is at writing detection, it's up to you to write and tune it to your environment. Otherwise, you're just going to need to accept the risk. And I think there are parts of that that are true, but I also think that a huge amount of adversary behavior across the environment, across the industry, is opportunistic and looks kind of the same everywhere. Um, but that doesn't mean that it's sufficient to only detect that stuff. So as you're covering this, make sure that you cover like our experience around that topic as well, please.
I'm glad you called that out. And so this is like an interesting when you kind of think about the challenge that we or any managed service faces. It's that if we write detections, but it's up to you, the customer, to tune those things, like you might as well go do it yourself, right? Like that really diminishes the value of having someone else do it for you. And so like this is not a managed services commercial, but this is like, I'm glad you call that out, Colin, because that is like that's a uniquely challenging problem. And I'll explain to you exactly, I think. And this is really specific to like SIEM and workflow. Um, so where does SIEM fall short? And this is not an exhaustive list. I tried to cherry pick the big ones. I led with cost instead of making that the last but not least thing, because I think cost is a consideration, but it's one consideration, right? And Dave, I think we've talked about this in past episodes. I think like you in particular, I remember kind of like, gave this example of like looking back at like retro hunting and doing things like, looking back over long periods of time. And when you look at doing that inside of a SIEM, you need the data to do it and you need the retention to do it. But there was another component which is kind of insidious, which is the compute, right? Like you are not just paying for data and data retention, you're paying for compute. And so when you want to ask these really broad questions, and this is particularly for like retroactive hunting and saying, hey, like I got a bead on something and I want to know if it's happened before. Um, there's a really like one of the most challenging aspects of that is literally just paying for the compute to go through the exercise of asking that question, like irrespective of the data.
Mhm.
Um, but these next two are the really big ones. State. So this for us, I kind of like always joke that, like we call it the state combiner, is probably like the one really unique piece of computer science that we've like built it and had to scale at Red Canary, which means that, and this started with like, being very endpoint bound, but this app, like the same thing applies in a different way to identity and other, like primarily identity and in particular user identity, like sessions, which is that it's very rare, more so with computers and less so with identities, that like a bad thing is going to happen right away. Meaning, for instance, you boot a Windows system or a Mac OS system. There's a whole bunch of processes running that over time may be made to do something bad, but it's very rare that those processes start when the computer starts and immediately a bad thing happens. That almost like that's very rare. And so having to hold state and understand that a bad thing might happen over the course of like hours or even days and figure out how to accommodate that when you're looking at detection logic is like super challenging. Um, And then the last one is the one that, when you kind of talk about tuning being a challenge, um, this one is probably, I'd say, like, the most unique and powerful part of the workflow, that we like really required to do this at scale, which is a suppression driven workflow, which is very different, I'd say, from like an accuracy, like an analytic accuracy driven workflow. And so like a suppression driven workflow means that like we actually desire false positives coming into into the CERT or into the SOC. And we want to give the SOC really good tools for saying, hey, in this environment, this PowerShell process with these crazy looking flags making this network connection is actually okay because, and you can kind of chain those things together because it was triggered by this other thing that we trust, because it's talking to this thing that we trust, and because it has these other attributes that we trust. Um, and that right there is probably like, if I had to answer, like, what's the one thing that SIEMs can't do in general, I've not seen one that can do this well ever, um, is accommodate that suppression driven workflow, which means like, let me write a relatively broad analytic, but let me give my analysts really great tools to say, this is okay in this circumstance because, and be able to feed that back in.
So why do you think that after us doing something like this for 10 years, why do you think the SIM vendors haven't picked up that as a core capability that they should support?
I mean, a relatively small percentage of SIM users are doing a meaningful number of investigations. I think that's a really simple one. I think like the majority of folks, or I'd say like maybe that's not a fair characterization, or I'm not like explaining it correctly, but um,
It's
I
just
guess
not
maybe
demand
the
for it.
demand isn't there, right? Like if the demand was there, they would do it. But they are optimized and they're paid first based on storage and compute. Um, and so like there's, there, that's that's what those systems are optimized for, is like make it simple to get data in and make it simple to ask questions. And suppression is important, but like it's complex, right? Like it's complex and unique system that's required to do that. Um, and it frankly, I'd say like there's probably a small percentage of teams like using SIMs operationally that like can support it to begin with. And beyond that, I'm just not sure that like I'm not sure that's a feature that SIM customers are clamoring for. I think overwhelmingly SIM customers are clamoring for like more integrations, easier to get the data in, simple rules language.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's naturally not a super high degree of like SOC maturity, high volume of like rigorous investigation. And that's just like a product of people's staffing. So
So I hear two things in here, that like if I was going to go try and do this alone, at an organization and I were to bring in a SIM, you would recommend focusing on building in the ability to do suppression for analytics. Um, and then I just totally lost what the other one was. Oh, I think the other thing that I think we've used to scale the organization was like our detection language that we use abstracts away a lot of the complexity of the like the Splunk query language, which can be a pretty specialized language to deal with.
yeah. And like when I say this is not exhaustive too, I mean there's other things we're not we like the rules language kind of triggered this thought, which is that like um the ability to control that, right? Almost like macros or functions that help you kind of like short circuit or snap certain parts of detection logic together or drive accuracy in certain areas. Like that's a limitation. Um, Either a limitation because of the rules language itself, but and or because of the limitation imposed on compute if you were to do that, right? Just kind of like having to insert that all over the place. And the other big one is just the ability to generate, raw statistics related to analytics and use those to do things like prioritize. So like you want your most accurate and impactful analytics to result in events that are shown to your analysts first. And so like,
Yep.
there's a whole bunch of pitfalls, and it's definitely one of those things where like the more of those pitfalls you kind of like look at and care about. And for us, like unlike a lot of places, like we have to care about all of them. You just kind of like those limitations become really acute. So,
Cool.
all right, we're at the halfway point. So we're going to jump over, kind of break into our discussion topic this week, followed by a brief demo. So,
Hey, what's going on in the Middle East?
not much. I was hoping you knew. I haven't been paying any attention. Um, and this
Very fun.
was like, for those of you who are customers, our Intel team sent out, like they did a great job just kind of like pulling together, I'd say, the headlines into a bulletin last week, and maybe we'll dig into that first. Um, and like really, when things started to really flare up and the strikes in Iran took place, both, first from Israel and then the United States, we naturally started to get just kind of a crush of inbound inquiries related to this. And so these were the headlines that we pulled out from that, or that I pulled out from that. And I'd say like there is, the first one's probably not a big surprise, I think. And like any state actor, I think we've been reading about these. You mentioned North Korea earlier, Iran, Russia, China. You can kind of pick any of the cyber boogeymen. They might say the same about us. Um, and so, but in particular, like, there's a handful that do have this, like there's a pattern of retaliation. And I think that's what folks were worried about. And the really big thing, and maybe the thing I think we want to talk about today, is that everyone's threat and risk profile is unique and uniquely important. And that's kind of like a no shit statement. But I do think there's a little bit in there to unpack. And so like um, this was also, I thought, like a great list of questions to ask when you're thinking about it, like assessing exposure, right? And like if Adam, I think we got the poll results here. I am kind of curious, which I think the poll results kind of tree up under the top there. But this is good example, right? So this doesn't mean that like, if you said no, that you're not at risk. I think, the CISA in particular is like trying to do a good job saying, hey, if you're in these industries in particular, you're uniquely at risk. And if you're going through your, you know, how much sleep should I lose kind of flow chart, if you're in one of those industries, like you're probably going to lose a little bit of sleep. Um, but I think, like the rest of these, even, when we were talking about these yesterday, it's almost like a Mad Lib. You could absolutely like, you can blank out some of these and you could fill in, the country, the industry and things like that,
Hey,
irrespective of actor.
I've got a question for you around this. I'm going to surprise you with this one. Like you, let's say you've got a bunch of actors working for the backing the Iranian state that are looking to do some retaliation. They're going to have limited resources, right? They're not going to be able to attack absolutely everybody in the world, and so assessing your exposure is reasonable. Do we have any sense about whether any of those actors, instead of just targeting specific strategically important industries, might look to just wreak some mayhem just to disrupt things here in the West?
Uh, yeah, absolutely. I think there's a radically simple answer to that question. If you look at it, and like I'm bad coming up with the APT names and numbers off the top of my head, but I can't remember if it's in the CISA advisory or if it's in either the CISA or the FBI's like, APT landing page for Iran as an example. Um, I mean, there's a component of this, which is like if you're in critical infrastructure or some of these other industries, you're going to have a problem. And then the next line will tell you, by the way, these are like probably among the most pervasive ransomware operators in the world, right? And so to your point about wreaking havoc, like some of this is like really specialized, but you made the point, Dave, that it's like they all have finite resources, right? Like you are not going to see the top 1% of offensive cyber teams coming after any meaningful number of targets. It's just like it's not feasible. Um, and so where they achieve scale and kind of mayhem and disruption is like in addition to some of these really targeted attacks with really specific objectives, like what is far more likely is that like ransomware is going to flare up. And if you peel back the layers of the onion far enough, you're going to find one of these folks behind it. So, um, So I'm not sure if that's like, if that answers your question, but I
It
think,
does.
yeah, I think that's a really good example. And this was a little bit of elaboration from like our Intel bulletin. I stole this chart. And the point here being that like you know, there are the highly targeted specialized attacks, there are commodity attacks. Um, and in this case, our team was just trying to call out, the techniques that these folks use, whether it is like a state adversary going after a particular type of target for a strategic reason, or a criminal who could also be a state adversary going after someone for an opportunistic reason. Uh, that the like how they're going to show up will be largely the same, right? And I think yesterday when we were kind of chatting, Dave, it's like I feel like I have a soapbox that is like just, hey, everyone remember the adversaries are subject to the laws of physics. Like if they need to get into a computer system, there are so many ways to do it. And there are so many things you can do when you get there. Um, and
Right.
so,
And I think the key takeaway for me was that the state-sponsored actors are using the same techniques, the same tactics, same procedures as the criminals are, which should be an encouragement for us as defenders in that we have a limited menu of things that we need to be watching for, which makes it possible for us to succeed in defending ourselves, right?
yep. Yeah, I think so. And, it is, the implementations and like I think the thing that sets like really sophisticated offensive operators apart is like very occasionally it is, you know, think about Stuxnet, right? Like that's a really specific example of a wildly specific target that took an incredible amount of like planning and forethought and program protection to make happen.
Right.
At the end of the day, there was a USB thing and some other very commodity stuff that happened, but like it was the planning and it was like the environment, and all the complexity related to just like overall, like, getting in there in the first place and communicating. Like that was the really complex part of that. Um, and I think that's the case in most of these, which is like it is planning and coordination that set these folks apart, far less so than, an attack tactic technique that no one's ever seen before, right? And I
Yeah, so we didn't talk about this when we were preparing, but I'm curious, have we seen or have you seen in any of your reading any indication that any of these state-sponsored actors have been dwelling within environments with a foothold that they can actually activate in the event of a conflict like this? I mean, we talk about
um
planning and resourcing. That would be the way I would look at doing that is like, have the attack in place. Like I remember when a lot of the critical infrastructure stuff was in the news in the last year or so. There's the worry is that China's all up in our telecom systems and stuff
yeah.
like that. And you wonder like how many folks have backdoors ready to just, Trojan horse ready to go.
Yeah, I couldn't remember the name of the report, and there have been a few of these, but I'd say like telecommunications, and I'd say call it critical infrastructure, which could be energy, it could be telecom, but over 2 decades, those have consistently been the places where, someone turns over a rock and finds someone who may have been there for a really long time. And of course, like, once you kind of have a bead on that, you start to look more closely at it. And in few or no cases are you lucky enough to have found the only instance of that where someone is just like, kind of gain a foothold somewhere and you just sit and wait, right? I would, say this is, a little bit sensational, but like this is like it's like the Hezbollah pager version of like infrastructure and other types of cyber attacks, right? Which is like, whatever led to the Hezbollah pager thing had probably been in place for who knows, like years, right? And so it was just like, everyone's doing that, right? You have a toolkit of things and you have a bunch of capabilities that you just want or need in your hip pocket. Um, and you will put a bunch of those in place, having no idea when they're going to become important. But like, when you find yourself in a pinch, you kind of go back to that menu of options and say, hey, like, what do we have? What do we have on standby that we can bring to bear? And particularly when it comes to critical infrastructure, I think that's like the really, that's the scary manifestation of those.
Oof. So we were also talking, you took the slides down, but we talked yesterday about like, what is the process? If you feel like, like you are uniquely susceptible to the eye of Sauron turning your way,
Yep.
like what's the process that you might consider following to gain some comfort that you're ready and waiting for them?
Yeah. So this is where I was gonna ask you to pull this back up, Adam. So I started going down the road of just like reusing some old material we had and figuring out, kind of using that playbook that is like read a threat report, figure out the techniques and in what order adversaries are doing things, and then go through and kind of, make for yourself the map that is like, if we believe we're being targeted, like this is how we believe they'll show up. And if they show up, do we feel like we're prepared? And then you can obviously test that. Um, this is output of I did a Gemini Pro deep research exercise on this early this morning because I was curious. Like there are so many open source resources related to so many adversaries and like Iranian in particular. And so I need to figure out how to share like the entire kind of like Gemini like prompt and discussion with folks. So we'll figure that out as a challenge for the office hours team, just for folks here. But effectively just prompted and said, hey, go scour the internet, find every open source resource related to Iran you can. And what I want are the like the top three most prevalent or like best, most referenced threats. But most importantly, like I want to understand their initial access techniques and I want to understand the techniques they use most often. And so like Dave, when we were kind of talking about this yesterday and I was like, challenge accepted, uh, I did this. And so this is all I will say, like, this is funny. Like you'll see things in here, like there are some goofy charts that like all add up to 100%. Ignore that. But I think when you kind of look at the left-hand side here, and again, if I can figure out how to share the full output of this, like it was really impressive the number of sources it used and the amount of synthesis it went through to say, hey, these are the three most often cited like initial access methods: phishing, social engineering, exploiting public facing applications. And you can see like there's some more detail in here later that's a little bit more specific, and valid accounts. And then when you kind of look at post compromise, like what happens after they get in, and again, ignore the evenly distributed chart on the left, but doing things like PowerShell, LSAS, and C2 via web protocols. And like this I think is the exercise that like if you had an entire intelligence team and platform and all this data at your disposal, that most folks would intuitively like, this is the question you'd want to ask and the type of answer you want. Um, Again, 100% distribution here, but in some ways like it's fair because this is what I asked for. I said like, give me the techniques that are common to like the most prevalent actors. And so this is not Red Canary threat intelligence product, but I do think it's a useful distillation. And in particular, I think we'll leave you with this, right? Which was, you know, in my opinion, a really useful, like when Dave, I think your specific question yesterday was like, so what? Like, so what? You're telling me about all these things and you're telling me there's overlap between like really sophisticated bad people and really, really financially motivated bad people. Um, but what do you do about it, right? And so like things like this level of takeaway I think was super useful. Like you can see a pretty tight like correlation and integration here of like the initial access techniques, post compromise techniques, and then mitigations for each of those things, either to prevent them or to find them, right? And so I don't know, like curious your feedback on this. And if we go into a couple minutes of overtime today, that's fine. If anybody wants to hang out, we'll keep an eye on the chat. But I don't know. I thought this was useful, and I'm curious, like, in your position, Dave, as a CISO, like, if some is this what you expect when you ask the
Abs-
team, like, so
Absolutely.
what?
Yeah. So like, and this is the reason that I can sleep at night, right? It is because every few months some new awful thing pops up, and executive leadership comes knocking on my door saying, "Are we about to lose everything because of this new unique attack?" And like, there's really very few things that are new under the sun. And so it's always encouraging to say, hey, look, we've been focusing and investing on the basics. this, phishing resistant MFA, hardening the perimeter, secure identity and access. Like being able to show with some amount of data and objective backup that the basic hygiene of your security program in your identified and detect or identify and protect columns and your detect and respond columns of the NIST CSF framework, you're able to say, look, we are doing the things that we're supposed to be doing that are going to allow us to withstand this type of scrutiny. And like there's never going to be an impenetrable system, but your goal is to make it not worth the time to attack you, make it worth them going after somebody else. I know if we got folks still on, I would love a quick yes or no in the webinar chat. I had a conversation with a friend over at Marsh McLennan's Cyber Research Center. I don't remember what it's called. And they've done some statistical studies. They're an insurance company. They've done some studies around which controls materially reduce the probability of a breach. Is that a topic that would be interesting to the folks on this call? If that's an interesting topic, we'll line up Matt. Alex Berninger. She was on last week.
Yep.
Matt Berninger, her husband, is actually leading that organization over there, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff over there.
Oh, I would love that. I would personally raise my hand for that. I have a real soft spot for cyber insurance, and
Yeah.
in the strangest way, because I do like have this kind of like deeply held belief that like one of the only ways you kind of drive real change is just like coupling this stuff to the economics. And in addition to, like, I know there's like Matt and others, like the coalition folks have done some awesome research on this. And I was out in Vegas for a work event a few weeks ago and had a fascinating discussion with a company that's doing very similar things. And I think it's absolutely awesome. I think, and in particular, figuring out like exactly how much like preventative and detective, like exactly how many of those controls and exactly how much of that investment, like what's
Yeah.
kind of the tipping point when you're like, all right, we're not perfectly safe. No one is, but like at this level of investment doing these things, like we can say like we're kind of over the hump, right? Like we are safe enough to be like protected from most impactful things. And that's not okay for
Right.
everybody. Like that's not okay for really anybody for us, like, our mentality in this industry. And I think the folks here, but I think that's like that level of clarity. I would love to do that. I think that'd be a super fun discussion.
Yeah, it was he gave me an opportunity to do a pre-read on this presentation and just the comparison of controls that were in place for all of their insured companies versus controls in place for the ones that filed claims was interesting.
Yep.
It reveals a sort of an interesting gap, I think, in the community data that we have available, right? Because I think there's a certain amount of shame in reporting to your insurance that there's been a breach, and would love to start, or to help continue banging the drum that we need to be more transparent with each other about breaches that we experience, whether we report losses to insurance or not,
Yep.
because we're all kind of blind from an actuarial perspective. And those, the work that they're doing translates into the language of risk that the business understands. And the better actuarial data we have, the better we're going to be able to drive good decision making and investment.
Yeah.
So we'll get him lined up.
Yeah, let's do that. I think I was trying to think through the name of the company that I had an opportunity to cross paths with, and it was Resilience. Like they're doing some, and like they had a really unique approach, which was, and I can't remember what the dollar amount was, but it was significant. It was not like, suffered 100, a couple hundred grand in losses. It was like, hey, what are the things leading to like $1 million or greater loss events? Just start there. And then, yeah, you can work your way backwards and you can dial that in as much as you care to. But like from an insurance perspective, I thought that was a really neat and simple line to draw, which is to say, like, we're looking at millions of dollars worth of losses and we want to
Yep.
figure out what's the short list of things that will avoid those.
Yep.
And then everyone else can continue to invest, as they're able. So
All right.
awesome. Well,
Hey,
we,
one last thing before we sign off. I got to call
yeah,
this out. If you haven't, I got a DM from an old buddy of mine I haven't heard from in a long time, a guy named Rich Murch. He just dropped CVE 2025 32 462 and 463. He has got two CVEs in sudo, which like that's been around for a long time to get a privesc in sudo and a chroot privesc in sudo. Like that's kind of a big deal. So I want to give a shout out to Rich for doing some awesome research. I haven't had a chance to read both all of those articles yet, but go give them a look and if you're rocking sudo in your environment, you might need to look at patching.
I would like to point out the irony in finding a privilege escalation vuln in a tool that exists only to perform privilege escalation. That's great.
I'm assuming
Awesome.
that
Well,
this bypasses the actual
yeah.
Yeah.
It's doing it the unintended way. I love it.
Yeah. You're reminded of the stop hitting yourself meme. Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, thank you very much, everyone, for being here.
right.
Dave, it's awesome to be back. Great to
Great
see
seeing
you
you.
again after a few weeks away. And we will see you all again next week. Thanks for hanging on. Appreciate it.
See you, everybody.